They found him there motionless, except for the tremble in his ribs. A German shepherd, caked in ash and silence, resting beside a pile of baby clothes that no longer smelled like the child who wore them. His ears twitched every time the wind moved the fabric, as if listening for a breath that wouldn't come. This isn't a story about rescue. It's a story about remembering, about loyalty that refused to die with the fire, about a baby who couldn't speak and a dog who wouldn't leave. The path they walked together was quiet, barely noticed, but for those who watched closely, there was something sacred in the way they found each other. Like, share, and tell us where in the world you are watching from today. The world smelled of soot and wet wood. Somewhere nearby, a fire engine had long stopped crying. Its echo still clung to the trees, as if the pines themselves hadn't yet processed what had happened. The ground was soft with mud, rutted by heavy boots and forgotten wheels. Beneath a willow bent from smoke, the dog lay curled beside what had once been a laundry basket, its plastic warped, half melted at the edges. The inside cradling scraps of cotton pajamas and the charred ghost of a child's onesie. The German shepherd didn't lift his head when they approached, not when the medic shifted gravel, not when the deputy knelt, not even when the neighbor called his name or the name they thought was his. His ears flicked at the syllables, but his eyes stayed on the basket. His nose, flecked with soot, remained close to a tiny sock that hadn't burned. No collar, no tag, just scars beneath fur, and a left hind leg that twitches without rhythm, as if still running from something. The deputy muttered something about animal control. The neighbor offered to get a leash, but the median older woman with a face carved by years of watching people grieve said softly, "Don't." She crouched low, one hand resting near the rim of the basket, palm upturned, offering nothing. Just presence, thought the dog. Finally looked at her, not a glance. A look, it was the kind of eye contact that pulls something ancient out of a person, something wordless. His gaze was heavy, not fearful but tired, as if he'd seen what no one else had, and was still deciding whether the humans around him were worth telling. She didn't ask again. She didn't move closer. She simply whispered, "You waited." Wind brushed the fabric. A lavender bib fluttered against his chest. He didn't flinch. Instead, he nosed it closer, with a tenderness that broke the medic's composure. Her breath caught, not loudly, but enough. Somewhere back toward the remains of the house. A reporter's flashbulb went off. The dog turned sharply, shielding the basket with his flank. "They shouldn't be photographing him," the medic murmured. "They're not," the deputy said. "They're getting the porch." But it didn't matter. The shepherd knew where to position himself. He knew what to protect, and still, no one could say where he came from. He hadn't been listed on the lease. The neighbors didn't recall a dog. There were no microchips, no lost posters, no frantic phone calls asking about a shepherd seen on the road. And yet he was here, sitting watch, whining low when the wind shifted, only to still again when the clothes were calm. Someone tried food, chicken from a sandwich. He sniffed it, then left it untouched. Another tried calling, but his ears twitched only at the sound of a child's name. The name whispered among the responders, carried on clipboards, heavy with the weight of being the one thing no one wanted to confirm yet. A girl, 16 months. They hadn't found her. Not yet, but the shepherd had. He kept his vigil, not like a stray, but like something older, something tethered. The medic finally stood. "He's not going anywhere. What do we do with him?" "Let him grieve," she said quietly. "We'll make room." They cordoned the area half-heartedly. More for the cameras than the dog. People came and went. Some stared. Others shook their heads. The story was already traveling through the town of the shepherd who wouldn't leave the baby's clothes. They didn't know what to call him, so someone scrawled guardian on a plastic bowl and left it near the tree with water. He didn't drink it. That night, the street lights flickered under the rain. The embers in the home's blackened frame finally cooled. Tarps were pulled over windows, and crime scene tape fluttered like tired streamers. But beneath the willow, the shepherd curled tighter, nose pressed to a pink washcloth half buried in ash. The town would later say the baby must have loved him, that maybe he was her protector all along, hidden from sight. Others claimed he'd wandered in afterward, drawn to something in the wreckage, something he remembered. But none of that mattered, because on the third morning, just after the clouds parted and light pooled over the singed lawn, a tiny sound broke the silence. Not a bark, not a voice. It was a breath, high and raspy. From somewhere behind the tarp where a search crew had long given up, the shepherd lifted his head. He stood, and for the first time since anyone had seen him, he moved, limping forward, slow but deliberate. He brushed past the medic and padded toward the collapsed edge of the back porch. His nose touched something small, something shifting, a rustle, a hand, not a bark, a whine, deep and rhythmic, then silence again. The medic shouted. The responders ran. They followed where the shepherd stood, buried in a crawlspace beneath the debris was a small child, alive, cold, barely breathing, but alive, covered in soot, wrapped around a bundle of ash-dusted fabric, the same lavender bib clutched in one hand. Her eyes unfocused, her lips are blue, but her fingers were curled in two. The shepherd's fur. He didn't move when they lifted her. He stayed pressed close, like a shadow cast in loyalty, even as the medic wept and the responders worked, even as the cameras returned and a new story began. The dog stood steady. When the baby was placed into the ambulance, someone opened the door again. He comes to, the medic said, and without a command, the shepherd leaped inside. Not fast, not whilst, not wild, just sure, as if he had already made the decision days ago, as if he had always known this baby would be his to follow. There are things you only notice when the world slows down, the sound of a siren echoing long after it fades, the way ash smells is different from dust, the feel of silence when it settles into the folds of a blanket where a heartbeat used to sleep. I didn't know the baby. I wasn't part of her life, not in the way that made sense on paper, but the dog said he wouldn't leave her side, and somehow, after everything that happened, he wouldn't leave mine either. We'd barely gotten home from the hospital. Not home really, a temporary shelter, a few blocks away, part of the church's emergency housing network, the kind of place where no one asks for your name too many times, and where the walls carry the ghost. Sounds of other people's disasters. I was the only one left to sign the paperwork for the child. Emergency kinship custody, they called it. The mother's niece I hadn't seen in years was gone. The fire had taken her quickly, they told me. Smoke inhalation. She had tried to get to the baby's room. She hadn't made it past the stairs. The father was never in the picture. Just a name on a birth certificate and a phone number that led nowhere. I didn't even know the child existed until the call came from a social worker, who sounded far too calm for the words she was saying. And the dog, well, they assumed he was mine. They let him stay, under supervision. Said the baby had responded to him, that he might help regulate her distress, that he might help her trust. But I could see it went both ways. That first night, the baby wouldn't sleep unless the dog was within reach. Her little fingers gripped his fur like a lifeline, and he didn't move, not once. Even when his muscles cramped or his paw twitched, he simply lay beside her cot on the floor, his breath syncing with hers until she finally drifted off. I hadn't seen anything like it, not in my years teaching, not in my years helping friends raise children. There was something unspoken between Thema, grief neither could express, stitched together with quiet and breath, and the raw instinct to stay close. I sat in the corner of the room, half wrapped in a second-hand quilt, watching the rain beat along the window. The baby had no voice for what she'd endured, but the dog didn't need one. Every now and then, he'd look at me, not for food, not for permission, just to see if I understood. I didn't, but I wanted to. The next morning, the baby woke before dawn, not with a cry, but a soft whimper, the kind that catches in the throat before it becomes sound. The dog was already alert, standing beside her crib, tail low and still. He nosed the bars gently, watching as her fingers reached between the slats for his ear. That was when I realized he hadn't barked once, not since we'd arrived, not even when someone knocked, or when the shelter cat passed outside our door, or when a stranger walked by. He moved with precision, with caution, as if afraid his own voice might disturb something fragile. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with an old photograph in my hands. It was the only one I had of my niece. She was 12 in the picture, standing beside a summer fair carousel, holding a stuffed bear like it was made of porcelain. I hadn't seen her in a... The rain had stopped, but the sky was still hung in gray. The smell of smoke lingered in his coat, no matter how gently I tried to clean it. I knelt beside him and traced my fingers along his collarbone, where fur hats worn thin and old bruises, long-heeled, painted a silent history. Someone had hurt him once. Someone had left him long before the fire. I wanted to ask him why he stayed behind. Why didn't he run when the flames reached the porch? But of course, there are no answers for that. Only the reality that he did, and that now he stayed again. That afternoon, the baby cried out for the first time, a real cry, shaky, high-pitched, like her throat was remembering how to call the world back to her. The caseworker was there at the time, mid-sentence about trauma therapy and adjusted routines, but we both froze when we heard it. The dog was the first to move. He rushed to her, gently nudging the side of the mattress until her tiny arms found his neck. She stopped crying immediately. The caseworker looked at me. "I've never seen anything like it," she whispered. Neither had I. We still didn't know his name. No one had claimed him. No one knew where he came from. But when I looked at him that night, curled beside the baby again, his eyes following every breath she took, I knew he didn't need a name. He just needed to stay. And so I let him. Some mornings began with silence, and others with the sound of the baby reaching for breath in her sleep. But always, before I opened my eyes, I heard the dog stir first. He didn't bark. He never whined unless she did. He didn't even drink water unless the baby was awake, as if her breath kept him anchored, and everything else waited on her rhythm. By the third day, we had begun to settle into a fragile kind of routine. I still couldn't call it normal. Nothing about grief is normal. It just rearranges your life around the absence and forces you to pretend you understand the new shape it takes. I had placed a folded towel on the edge of the baby's playmat and spread a pillow beside it. That's where the dog always lay. Never inside the crib. Never on the bed. Just beside, close enough to watch her eyes, to catch her fingers when they reached for his fur. That morning, I noticed something new. As the baby sat up, wobbly and wide-eyed, she pointed. Not toward a toy, not at me, but at the small black box I'd kept on the windowsill. It was the box they'd returned to me from the fire site. A half-melted case with a zipper burned stiff. Inside were remnants, a baby spoon, a scorched pacifier clip, and something I hadn't touched since I placed it there. The collar, dark leather, partially burned. No name tag, no city registration, just a brass ring, dented on one edge. The ring looked older than the collar itself, as if it had once belonged to something else. Something passed down, or salvaged. The baby reached for it again, so I opened the box. The dog didn't move from his spot on the mat, but his ears lifted, one tilting toward me in the way dogs do when they're listening without wanting you to know they are. I took the collar in my hand. It was heavier than I remembered, not in weight emotionally, like it carried something unfinished. I knelt in front of the dog. "Hold it out, slowly. You wore this, didn't you?" I whispered. He looked up. His eyes didn't blink, didn't shift. They stayed on the brass ring. I didn't try to put it on him. Something told me not to. Instead, I placed it beside his paws and watched as he gently lowered his snout toward it. He breathed in once, then closed his eyes and let his chin rest next to it, like he was remembering something. I would never know. The baby crawled forward. She didn't touch the collar. She only touched him. Her little palm flattened against his shoulder, and he responded with the softest exhale I'd ever heard from a living thing, like a sigh made of memory. That afternoon, we went outside. It was the first time I took both of them together, the baby bundled in a second-hand stroller, the dog walking beside me without leash or hesitation. He matched our pace as if he'd been trained, though I'd never once seen him respond to a command. The streets still smelled of rain and smoke. A few neighbors passed us without much notice. A few recognized the dog, gave me a soft nod, said things like, "Bless him," or "He's still guarding, isn't he?" I didn't reply. I just let him lead us down a block I hadn't planned on turning toward. He stopped in front of an old chain-link fence that bordered a shuttered playground. The swings creaked in the wind. The grass had gone to seed. But the dog's attention was fixed on a small corner near a crumpled metal trash can. He approached, slow but purposeful, and sniffed along the base of the fence. Then he pawed once, twice, until something clinked, loose, and rolled onto the sidewalk. A key, attached to a broken ring, with rusted numbers etched into a tag so thin it looked like foil. The numbers didn't match any address I knew. The tag read, #112. I reached for it carefully. The baby leaned forward in her stroller, wide-eyed dot. The dog stood perfectly still. "What is this?" I whispered. No one answered, but something about the way the key gleamed beneath soot, beneath years of dirt, told me it mattered. The dog had led us here for a reason. We continued walking, and I slipped the key into my pocket. That night, after the baby was asleep and the house hummed with quiet, I examined the key again. #112. I checked the collar once more, run my fingers along the inside seam, and that's when I saw it barely visible beneath the burned leather. Etched in with something sharp, hand-carved, crooked and faint, M plus a dot, 2 initials. Worn deep into the leather. A pair, or perhaps a memory. I don't know what made me think of it then. Maybe the way the dog still lay with his nose pressed to the baby's blanket. Maybe the way her foot had shifted in her sleep, and he had immediately adjusted to give her space. But I suddenly imagined someone else's hands carving those initials, sitting on a porch, or maybe kneeling beside a child. The collar didn't come from a pet store. It came from love, or loss, possibly both. The next morning I woke early. The baby hadn't stirred. The dog hadn't moved. But I had a feeling that settled deep in my bones, like something was waiting. I slipped the key into my coat pocket and stepped outside. The dog followed me without needing to be called. We walked 3 blocks, then 5, then turned left on a street I hadn't visited since before the fire. The dog stopped. I looked up. There it was, an old brick building with peeling numbers. Above the door, .112. The building looked like it had been forgotten, on purpose. Brick, layered over brick, with vines clawing up its sides and windows that hadn't opened in years. The metal numbers nailed above the stoop were dulled by rust, 112. Some of the screws had loosened, leaving the final digit dangling as if caught mid-shiver. The dog didn't hesitate. He moved toward the front door with a kind of reverence, not excitement, not fear, as if his paws remembered the rhythm of the porch boards before his mind did. I stood a few feet behind him, the key in my hand, warm from the walk. There was no sign, no mailbox, just a deadbolt and a doorknob mottled with age. I didn't know. What I expected may be to knock and have no one answer. Maybe to be wrong, to have followed a ghost story back to a building with nothing behind the door but dust and cobwebs. But the dog sat and waited, so I slid the key into the lock. It turned, not easily. There was resistance, as if the bolt hadn't shifted in years. But then, with a soft clack, the door cracked inward. The faint scent of cedar and something older drifting into the morning air. The dog didn't move until I pushed the door open fully. Inside, the world was dim. Dust motes floated in slanted rays of light, cutting through lace curtains. There were shelves too many for a home, not quite enough for a store, and they were full. Books, boxes, glass jars, with labels that had long since curled at the corners. It smelled like paper and a forgotten memory. The dog stepped inside first. He moved like someone returning to a room that had once been safe. His tail lowered, not in fear, but in humility. He sniffed the baseboards, then padded over to the far left corner, where a blue wool blanket still lay folded in a sunken basket, and he lay down. Just like that. He didn't explore, didn't search. He simply rested his chin on the blankets, edged like he'd been waiting to return. I stood in the doorway, reluctant to enter fully. Something about the space made me feel like an intruder, like I had opened a memory that wasn't mine. But the key had led us here. Or rather, he had. The room was strangely preserved. A wall calendar hung near the window. March, 3 years ago. A child's drawing was pinned to the back of the door. A stick figure holding hands with a large brown dog under a bright yellow sun. Crayon words spelled out me and armored. The name landed like a stone dropped into water. I turned to look at him. He didn't flinch at the sound. He just blinked, slow and even, as if hearing it underwater. As if time had made it soft around the edges. Armor had fit him, not in the way a name fits a pet, but the way a name fits a story. A name worn down by purpose. I stepped further into the room. Everything was arranged with care, like someone had meant to return. Photographs in wooden frames lined a narrow table. In one, a man with a thick beard knelt beside Armor, his arms slung around the dog's shoulders, both of them muddy and smiling. In another, a woman stood with a toddler on her hip. I sat slowly on the floor, staring at the image, my hands trembling just enough to make the frame rattle. I didn't understand. How could no one have known about this place? How could this part of her life have vanished without record? And why had Armor been gone from her story until now? I looked over at him. He was still by the blanket, still breathing slowly, even breathing. But his eyes were not asleep. They were watching me, calm and ancient, like he'd waited long enough and would wait still longer for the pieces to be understood. On a whim, I opened one of the drawers beneath the photo table. Inside, I found journals, spiral-bound, pages browned at the edges. The top one was labeled with a shaky pen, Mara and Armor, Year 1, Mara, my niece. She had kept a record, page after page, entry after entry. I skimmed through them, slowly, afraid the paper might crumble under my fingers. March 5th. Armor didn't leave Mara's crib all night. He laid there even when she pulled his tail in her sleep. I think she sleeps deeper when he's near, or maybe he breathes better when she does. April 9th. Took Mara to the clinic. Armor refused to stay in the car. He stood at the front door until they let him in. Didn't bark, didn't flinch when the nurse touched her. Just watched. June 2nd. Sometimes I think he knows what we're not saying. Mara's fever broke, and he didn't move from her side for 3 days. When she opened her eyes, he licked her palm once. That was it. Like he knew it was over. There were dozens more entries like that. Moments of quiet love, no drama. No flash. Just a mother, a baby, and a dog with a soul bigger than words. And then the entries stopped, abruptly. No closure, no final note. Just an empty page that followed a drawing Mara's small handprint, beside a paw print smudged in faded ink. I closed the journal and sat in silence. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees. Dust shifted through the light, like it had waited for someone to see it. Armor was awake now, sitting again. He watched me without moving. I think she meant to come back, I whispered. And I think he knew that she didn't. I didn't speak on the way back. Armor walked beside the stroller like he always did, head low, pace steady, one eye always on the baby. but something about him had changed. Not visibly, not in any way someone on the street would notice. But I could feel it in his silence, in the quiet hum that seemed to settle over him now, as if part of a weight he'd carried alone had finally been seen, and seeing it hadn't made it lighter, just shared. The baby cooed once, a faint breathy sound, and Armor's ears twitched. She hadn't made many sounds yet. No words, no babble. Just these tiny threads of breath that hinted at something locked away, something that hadn't quite returned from wherever the fire had pushed it. When we reached the door of the shelter apartment, I paused, my hand on the knob, the key half turned. And still, I couldn't stop thinking about that room. The blanket, the photo, the handprint beside the paw. I don't know why I did what I did next. Maybe it was an impulse. Maybe it was instinct. But before I turned the key the rest of the way, I reached down into the bottom of the stroller and pulled out the spare baby blankets, a soft fleece one with tiny stars stitched along the edge. I held it out. Armor stopped. He looked up at me. Then gently, he took the corner of the blanket in his teeth, not tugging, not playing, just holding it, waiting. And as I opened the door, I watched the baby stretch one arm out, reaching softly toward him. That was the first time I saw it. Not just a bond, but recognition. Inside I laid the baby down for her nap. Armor settled at the foot of her cot again, but this time, he brought the blanket with him. He placed it just beneath her mattress, tucked it there with one paw like he was anchoring her to something, maybe to memory. Maybe now. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching. The baby's fingers curled against the mattress. Her breath slowed, and Armor's did too. They matched, without effort. It was like listening to two instruments play the same quiet note. That evening, I pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years. It was tucked in the back of my closet, behind coats I hadn't worn. Since my knees started aching, and behind the suitcase I used to take to school conferences when I was still teaching. The box was labeled in handwriting that didn't belong to me. Mara, ages 6 to 12. Inside were drawings, report cards, letters I never sent. I unfolded one of them, written in my own pen, dated 8 years ago. Dear Mara, I know I haven't been there the way you wanted, or maybe the way you needed, but I never stopped thinking about you. If you ever need me, I'll come. No questions. Just reach out. She never did. Or maybe she had. Just not in the way I expected. Later, I sat at the kitchen table with the journal from the apartment. I hadn't told anyone about it. Not the caseworker, not the neighbors, not even the shelter staff. Something about it felt sacred. It wasn't mine. But now, in some way, the silence inside its pages belonged to me, too. I turned again to that last entry, the one with the handprint and the paw print. There was a date beside it. Faint, but readable. April 17th. I checked the calendar. Tomorrow is April 17. The next morning came with rain again. It drizzled softly against the window, a kind of hush that made the world move slower. The baby didn't stir until nearly 9 a.m. Armor hadn't moved from her side once. I watched as she sat upon crying. No fuss. She looked around the room once. Then she reached for the edge of the crib and pulled herself up. Slow but steady, her fingers curling tight for balance. Armor stood with her. He didn't bark, didn't whine, just stood. The baby took one step, just one step inside the crib. Not enough to move anywhere. Just enough to let her weight shift from holding to trying. And she looked at him. Not with confusion, but with something close to trust. I stood, frozen, in the doorway. She hadn't tried to stand since the hospital. The doctors said she might be delayed. That trauma does strange things to motor skills. But there she was, her tiny hand opened in the air. Reaching down, toward the dog that never left, her side. Armor pressed his nose to the mattress. That was all she needed. She sat again, quietly, content, and Armor resumed his place beside her. But I had seen it, that step, and I will not forget it. That afternoon, I dressed the baby in her warmest clothes and packed a few things in a cloth bag. Just some formula, a change of clothes, and a picture of Mara I had kept in my wallet for too many years. I looked at Armor. "Let's go," I whispered. I didn't know where exactly, only that something was calling, not just back to the apartment, but to whatever that date meant. The door to 112 opened more easily the second time. The air smelled the same cedar and memory. I placed the baby on the old blue blanket. She looked around, blinking slowly, then reached for a loose thread in the fabric, like it was something she'd always known. Armor didn't move to the blanket this time. Instead, he walked to the corner shelf, pawed once at a lower cabinet, and sat. Inside was a shoebox. I pulled it out slowly, heart drumming in my ears. Inside were three things: a photo of Merelder now, tired, smiling faintly with Armor by her side, a folded letter, and a white envelope, addressed to whoever comes next. I opened the letter. The handwriting was shaky. If you're reading this, it means Armor made it. He always did. Through everything. Through me. Through this life I couldn't hold steady. Please, whoever you are, tell my daughter I loved her. Tell her she was never alone. And if she doesn't remember my voice, let her remember his. He stayed. Even when I see OULDN single quotes. Mara, I held the baby close that night. Armor slept at the foot of the bed, the blue blanket folded beside him now, like a tether to something only he and she would ever fully understand. Outside, the rain fell again, but inside, for the first time in weeks, we breathed without counting the seconds. The days that followed felt like someone had pressed the world into slow motion. No new calls, no knock at the door, just time, thick and heavy as honey, stretching between small ritual formulas warming on the stovetop, the squeak of the stroller wheels down the block, the rhythm of Armor's breathing beside the crib at night. We didn't speak much, not even to the caseworker, who visited every few days. She understood enough to sit quietly in the kitchen, filling out her paperwork while sipping from the chipped mug I always gave her. The one with a faded cartoon owl and the words, "Still learning." The baby had begun humming, just soft vibrations, nothing tuneful. She didn't make words yet, didn't coo like other babies I'd known, but she hummed, a low, gentle sound like the wind passing through an old house. Armor responded every time, not with sound, but with presence. He would look up, ears tilted just enough, and rise to his feet slowly, as if that sound was the one thing he still recognized without question. And then he'd walk over and sit beside her as she lay on the blanket, a patient sentinel in a world that had grown too loud for both of them. It was during one of those quiet hours between breakfast and the baby's mid-morning nap that I finally opened the second letter, the one in the envelope marked to whoever comes next. My hands trembled just slightly, not from fear, from the weight of something unfinished. The note inside was short, less personal than the one Mara had written for her daughter. It simply read, "If Armor has led you here, he has chosen you. He does not follow without reason. He remembered." I folded the paper and slid it into the inside pocket of my coat. Armor was asleep beside the baby again, her tiny fingers curled just inches from his paw. She'd begun to move more in her sleep-soft kicks, a flutter of the arm, her little feet brushing against the hem of the blanket, like her body was remembering how to live without flinching. It had been 12 days since the fire. 12 days since she had been pulled from the wreckage. 12 days since a dog without a name arrived, in silence, and refused to leave. That evening, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No cries, no lights, just a different tone in the room. A stillness that didn't feel like peace. Armor had begun pacing, not frantic, just back and forth. From the baby's crib to the door, from the window to the kitchen, then back again. He'd do one circuit, then sit, then stand again, then repeat. I'd seen dogs pace before, anxious dogs. Bored dogs, but this was something else. Armor didn't look agitated. He looked prepared. I sat in the corner of the room and watched him move. The baby was asleep, her chest rising and falling steadily. Her brow was smooth for the first time since the hospital. Armor passed her once, slowed, stopped, and lowered his head, not in rest and reverence. Then he turned and came to me. He sat at my feet. Look at me. Really looked, and I knew. He wanted me to follow. I bundled the baby in her wrap and carried her against my chest. She barely stirred, just a soft sigh as her cheek pressed into the fabric. Armor waited at the door. We walked not to the apartment this time, not to any place we'd visited before. He led us past the burned lot, past the school, past the grocery where I used to buy my teaching snacks. He turned onto a back road, gravel crunching underfoot, and kept walking until we reached the edge of town where the streetlights grew sparse and the air smelled of pine. There, beneath a bent lamppost, sat a park bench, and beside it, a rusted donation box bolted into the sidewalk, the kind people used for used clothes and books. Faded letters on the front read, "Community free box for those still healing." Armor stopped in front of it. He sat, looked up at me. I didn't understand until I saw the sticker, a small paw print, faded, just like the one in Mara's journal. I knelt and ran my fingers over it. There was a panel beneath the box, a sliding tray, almost invisible unless you were looking. It opened with a soft click, and inside lay a bundle wrapped in plastic. I pulled it out gently. Inside the bundle was a child's sweater, fleece, light purple, one side singed but intact, and beneath it, folded neatly, was another letter. This one was addressed to me. By name, to Elaine. I didn't know if you'd come, but if you did, I needed you to know the whole story. Armor wasn't just our dog. He was Mara's first rescue. She found him under a stairwell when she was 17, injured, half-starved. She carried him home in a hoodie and stitched his wounds herself. She said he was the first living thing she ever chose to stay for. When she had the baby, Armor changed. He became something more. Protective in a way no one could explain. He wouldn't let anyone near her unless Mara said it was okay, not even me. But life grew harder, and Mara struggled. She tried to keep going, but some days, the weight of it, all the silence, the loss, the fear, it sat too close. That last week, she told me she was making arrangements, that she needed to leave things in place. She didn't say more, but I think she knew. If you're reading this, you were meant to find it. And Armor was meant to find her again. Don't turn him away. He's already saved more lives than you'll ever know. Thank you for being who she hoped you would be. No name, but it didn't matter. I sat on the bench in the dark with the baby breathing gently against my chest and the sweater in my lap. Armor curled at my feet, his body still and warm. I didn't cry. There was nothing left to cry out, just this moment. Just this stillness, just the quiet that followed. The sky was still ink dark. When I finally stood up from that bench. Armor rose, without prompting. He moved beside me with quiet certainty, like he'd been waiting for the moment I would understand not the facts, not the timeline, but the weight of the promise I had stepped into the day I said yes to that child. The baby stirred softly against my chest, her fingers curling into the fabric of my coat. She hadn't woken once during the walk or the quiet discovery beneath the donation box. It was as if the hush of the night had wrapped her in something protective, something older than memory. I didn't rush home. We walked slowly, as the first hints of light seeped between the rooftops and power lines, soft blues and grays brushing away the ink of night. The town was still asleep. Porch lights flickered in sets of twos, and the bakery on Maple hadn't yet begun its morning batch of rolls. When we reached the apartment, I paused on the stoop. Armor didn't move ahead. He waited, watching me with that still gaze, the one that seemed to reach places I'd buried decades ago. I don't know what made me speak aloud. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe it was the ache. But I whispered it quiet as a breath. Her name was Grace. The baby shifted slightly in my arms, her breath warm against my collarbone. She never said it aloud. I continued. Not once in that journal. Not in the hospital records. Not on any form or folder or caseworker file. But I know that's what she meant to name her. Armor blinked. Nothing more. But I felt something loosen in the air. Like a held breath finally exhaled. Later that morning, I placed the letter and the purple fleeced sweater in the top drawer of the dresser. I folded the fabric with care, tucking the burned edge beneath so it wouldn't catch or fray. Then I slipped the letter in beside the baby's hospital tag and the ultrasound photo I found pressed between the pages of Mara's journal. Grace. I would call her that now. It felt right, anchored, not chosen, and Armor seemed to know. That afternoon, I took her outside again, not far, just to the back lot behind the shelter building where the grass had grown wild and uneven, and the wind moved through the broken fence posts like a whisper of things long forgotten. Armor lay beside her as she sat upright on a folded blanket, her tiny hands reaching for weeds and soft dandelion heads. I watched them from a few feet away. She looked at him now, not with the blank stare of a baby still recovering from shock, but with something more curious, more connected. Her fingers would brush his shoulder, and he wouldn't even blink. She giggled once when his ear twitched beneath her palm. It was the first sound like laughter she'd made, and I swear, I saw his tail flick just once in response. That night, I found myself holding the collar again, the same one from the burned basket. Scorched at the edge, the brass rings still dull with age. But this time, I turned it over, not just to remember, but to read. M+A, Mara and Armor. But there was more. Carved faintly beneath that, a second set of initials, smaller, crooked, A+G. Armor, and Grace. I hadn't seen it before, hadn't noticed how the carvings overlapped slightly, how the first pair had faded but not disappeared, while the second had been etched in more recently. The curves were awkward, uneven, like they'd been pressed in by a shaky hand with something sharp and temporary. But they were there. Grace. She had named her, after all, maybe not in words. But here on the one thing Armor never left behind. Placed the collar beside the crib. That week, things began to change. Not all at once, not in dramatic, sweeping gestures, but in small, almost imperceptible shifts. Grace started reaching for her bottle on her own. She gripped my finger when I changed her, no longer listless, no longer staring into a middle distance that terrified me in those first few days. She began following Armor with her eyes. Every time he crossed the room, she watched, and more than that she waited. If he stepped out of the room, she turned her head. If he returned, her feet kicked softly against the mattress, like her body recognized his rhythm before her mind did. Armor, too, grew lighter, not in weight, but in presence. His gait softened, his pacing ceased. At night, instead of sleeping at the door or beneath the crib, he lay beside her without interruption. I found myself speaking to him more often. Is she remembering him through you? I'd ask. Or is she just finding her way forward? He never reacted to my voice. Never whined or wagged his tail in the way other dogs did. But he listened, in that room. Silence was a language we all began to understand. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the living room, I heard a soft thump. I turned. Grace was on the playmat, Armor nearby. She'd pulled herself to standing, both hands wrapped around the edge of a low shelf, her knees wobbling beneath her, her breath quick and shallow. Armor stood still, not touching her, but close enough that she could reach if she fell. She didn't. She took one step, then sat again. That was all. But it was enough. I didn't call anyone. Didn't pull out my phone to record it. I just stood there, one hand still full of a half-folded towel, letting the moment wrap around me like breath in winter. That night, after she was asleep, I stood in the doorway again. Armor raised his head to look at me. Grace had begun to hum again, not the ghost-like sounds of the early days, but something rounder, fuller. Her small voice rose and fell, like breath caught in memory. It wasn't a tune. It wasn't music, but it was hers. Armor sat facing the door, not restless, not alert, just watchful. He often did this in the late hours, as if the house changed when the sun left it, as if night carried a different kind of responsibility, one only he could answer. I'd come to trust his rhythms. He moved only when needed, when Grace stirred or cried, or when something, somewhere, shifted enough to pull him to his feet. He was a dog, yes, but never just a dog. That night, he didn't stir the dishes, not for the wind tapping the window, not even for the neighbor's cat who wandered across the porch with its usual aimless curiosity. But when the knock came, soft and tentative, his ears flicked up, he didn't bark, he simply stood. Grace paused mid-sip from her bottle. I reached for the door slowly. The knock didn't come again. Through the peephole, I saw a figure small, wrapped in a thick jacket, standing half in shadow beneath the bulb that buzzed quietly above our door. When I opened it, the woman stepped back, as if she hadn't expected me to answer. She looked to be in her late 20s. Short, curly hair pinned back from her face, pale eyes, too tired for someone her age. She clutched a folded document in one hand and a canvas bag in the other. "Are you Elaine?" she asked her, voice cautious. "Yes. I'm sorry to show up like this. I didn't know where else to go." Armor appeared at my side then, his presence sudden and solid. He stood between us, not growling, not aggressive, just there. The woman looked down and froze. "Is that Armor?" I said nothing. The question was already answered. Her eyes filled, sudden and silent. No sob, no gasp, just water rising too fast to hold back. "He's alive," she whispered. "I thought they said he never came back." She knelt, and Armor approached slowly, sniffing her coat, her bag. Then, he paused. His tail remained still, his body tense, but not frightened. "You know him," I said gently. She nodded. "He belonged to my sister." The breath caught in my throat. "Mara was your sister." Her hands trembled now. "Half-sister, technically. We didn't grow up together. Same dad, different mothers. I found out about her a few years ago. She never reached out until the baby was born. Said she didn't want anything, just that if something ever happened to her, I should find her daughter." She looked up. "Ishi." "She's here," I said. "She's safe." The woman let out a breath that folded her in half. She sat on the porch step, the canvas bag sliding from her shoulder to the ground. "I never met her," she said. "Never met the baby, but I kept her letters." Letters. She opened the bag, pulling out a bundle of envelopes held together by a rubber band. Some were unopened. Others had creases, fingerprints, tears where they'd been read too many times. She never said much about herself, but she always wrote about Armor and Grace. I glanced behind me, toward the living room where Grace sat still and silent, watching through the cracked door. Her cheeks were flushed from the warmth, her hair damp at the crown from the bath earlier. Her fingers curled around the soft edge of her blanket. "She doesn't speak yet," I said. The woman nodded. "I don't need her to." We sat in the kitchen, tea between us. Armor lying under the table with his chin resting near Grace's feet. She had crawled to him the moment the stranger stepped inside, her body pressing against his side as if to ask, "Are we safe?" And he had given her that answer with stillness alone. The woman's name was Lydia. "I live out in Red Bluff now," she said, stirring her tea, though she hadn't added sugar. "I moved there last fall. New job, cleaner start. But Mara had my address, from a letter I sent years ago." She pulled out one envelope from the bundle, this one in better shape than the others. "She wrote to me after Grace was born, said she named her after a dream. said Armor had started sleeping beside the crib before the baby ever cried. I felt tears rise in my throat again. I pressed my fingers against my mug and didn't speak. She said Grace changed everything, that her world had been a storm, but suddenly there was a center, and that Armor had chosen the baby the same way he once chose her. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, the wind picked up. Grace leaned into Armor's side and closed her eyes. She's bonded with him, I said finally. More than I've ever seen between a child and an animal. I don't think she'd sleep if he left. I don't think he would leave, Lydia whispered. She looked at him now, her eyes soft, but filled with something deeper reverence, maybe, or sorrow. He grieved when Mara died, didn't he? Yes, I said. He waited at the wreckage, by her baby clothes. For days, Lydia wiped at her face. That sounds like him. He was like that with our father too. He stayed with him when he passed. Didn't eat. Barely moved for days. He's done that twice now, I murmured. By the time Lydia stood to leave, the house had dimmed again, washed in the soft gray of approaching night. She crouched one last time to stroke Armor's head. I don't need to stay, she said. I just needed to know they were okay, that someone found them. She reached into her bag and handed me one last letter. It's for Grace, from Mara. She wrote it the week before the fire. I think she knew something was coming. I held it carefully, the envelope light in my hands, but full of something weightier than I could explain. Lydia smiled, faint, exhausted, but grateful. Then she turned and disappeared into the dusk. That night, as I sat beside Grace's crib and watched her breathe against the soft edge of the blue blanket, I placed the letter beside the journal in the top drawer. She will read it someday, when she could. For now, she had Armor, and that would be enough. There are moments that seem too quiet to trust, the kind where everything is in place. The baby asleep, the wind resting against the window pane, the kettle still warm but no longer whistling. You sit in that hush, waiting for the world to breathe wrong again, but it doesn't. Not yet. That's how the days passed after Lydia left. Grace had begun to walk, slowly and uncertainly, one hand often outstretched toward whatever surface might catch her fall. But Armor was always there before anything else. He didn't hover as he anticipated. He moved where she moved, waited where she paused. When she fell, she never cried. He was already beside her. People from the shelter started calling her the girl with the shepherd. They never used her name. I wondered if it was because they didn't know it, or because they sensed it was something private, something that hadn't quite finished becoming hers. She didn't need the words yet, not when he translated the world for her. On the 13th morning since Lydia's visit, a letter arrived. Not one of Mara's, not from Lydia either. This one came in a white envelope stamped with the emblem of the Department of Family and Child Welfare. Inside, a formal notice. A court hearing had been scheduled. Custody review. Final placement recommendation. I read it twice before I exhaled. Not because I was surprised, I knew it was coming eventually. Grace had been placed with me under emergency kinship, guardianship, a temporary arrangement. But the caseworkers, the forms, the quiet phone calls I hadn't been included in, they all seemed to be catching up at once. The date was set for the following Tuesday. 5 days. Armor was watching me, not from the crib, not from the kitchen floor, from the doorway. I didn't know how long he'd been there, but when I looked into his eyes, I knew he'd felt something shift. Grace toddled past him, a sock half fallen from her foot, a sippy cup clutched in both hands. She bumped into his side and steadied herself without looking. He didn't react, only adjusted, allowing her weight to balance against his frame. I held the letter loosely at my side and leaned against the wall. I don't know what they'll say, I whispered. I'm not her mother. I'm not young. I don't have the things they look for in those files. but I know how to love her. Armor blinked once, slow, and I know you're part of her. Whether they understand that or not, he didn't move. He didn't need to. That evening, I found Grace curled on the couch. Her body nestled into the crook of Armor's side. The collar he had once worn now, tucked beneath her arm like a doll. It still smelled faintly of smoke and old leather. I sat. Across from them, the light of the setting sun casting long shadows through the blinds. On the table before me was the envelope with the court notice. I hadn't told the caseworker yet, hadn't returned the call. I didn't know what to say. What if they said no? What if they took her somewhere else, to someone younger, with better insurance and a house with a yard? And what would happen to Armor? No one had claimed him, not legally. No one had chipped him. No vet had records. He belonged to no one, and yet, he belonged to her. The system wouldn't know what to do with that, would they separate them? Could they? The thought made my chest tighten. I reached for the phone and dialed slowly, pausing between each number as if the delay might change the outcome. The caseworker answered, "And if I don't?" Another pause. "Then we'll look into surrender options. He may go to a rescue, depending on the shelter's capacity." I closed my eyes. "She won't survive that," I said. My voice didn't rise, didn't crack. It just came out, hollow, the way words sound when they've already happened in your heart. Elaine, she doesn't sleep without him. She doesn't move without checking for him. Her first steps, her first sound, all of it came from his presence, not mine. "I understand how you feel, no," I interrupted, gently but firmly. "This isn't about how I feel. This is about what she remembers, even if she can't say it." The caseworker sighed. "We'll take that into consideration. I'll note it in the file," but I could hear it in her voice that the legal system had no space for feelings. Shaped like fur and breath, Armor was invisible to them, but not to me, and not to Grace. That night, I packed a small bag, just in case. I included Grace's favorite blanket, a photo of her mother, and the journal, now worn soft with handling. I didn't know what I was preparing for, but I knew what I wasn't willing to lose. When Grace finally fell asleep, her cheek resting against Armor's neck, I sat by the window with the letter again. My hands were steady. My thoughts, WEREN. Single quotes too. Armor lifted his head, once, and then to my surprise, he walked to me. He sat, pressing his weight lightly against my knee. I opened the collar again. The initials were still there. M plus A plus G. I traced them slowly with my thumb. "You chose her," I whispered. "You chose her first. Not because you were trained. Not because anyone told you to. You just did." Armor lowered his head into my lap and closed his eyes, and I made my decision. The next morning, I called Lydia. She picked up with a sleepy voice, but I didn't hesitate. "If something happens, if they don't let me keep Grace, will you take Armor?" Silence. Then, a breath. "I would. But I don't think he'd go." "I know," I said. "But I need to know he won't end up in a cage. He won't." And somehow, I believed her. 5 days remained until the hearing. 5 days to make our case. And Armor, he never once left Grace's side, because he already knew the answer. She was home, and he had never left. The courthouse didn't look like much. A squat, brick building at the edge of town with hedges trimmed too neatly, and a ramp that squeaked beneath the wheels of Grace's stroller.